Morning, everyone. Appreciate everyone coming out this morning. Last week we talked about relationship and how we were designed by God purposely to be in relationship with one another. And so today I want to expand on that by discussing what it means for us to love others. We all know the biblical mandate that we're to love our neighbor. So I want to wrestle with and kind of unpack what that means and specifically how and why that's so difficult. I think because we can all agree that it can be very trying at times. I want to start though by playing a song by a band that I really, really like. It's a band called Sister Hazel. And this is not one of their few songs that had commercial radio play. This is a song called Tear by Tear. And now that we have upgraded to the next level of technology, we won't be using my laptop. We actually have this Bluetooth jam box so everybody can hear, which is a really wonderful thing when you're listening to music. Being able to hear, it really helps a lot. So let's listen to this song and then we'll get going.
We all know sadness, and I feel your pain. Well, everybody knows a little loneliness sometimes, 'cause we're all the same. We all have sorrow. We all have shame. Everybody feels a bitter emptiness sometimes. Now what you gonna do about that? There's a way to keep going, step by step, try to fix what's been broken. Brick by brick, while your life will keep coming. Year after year, you drain the pain. Tear by tear, you drain away the pain. Tear by tear. Look around you. Every face that you see. Well, everybody gets a little paralyzed sometimes. The epidemic of our insanity. There's a way to keep going, step by step, try to fix what's been broken. Brick by brick, while your life will keep coming. Year after year, drain pain. Tear by tear, drain away the pain. Tear by tear.
Song goes on. It has a really, really great bridge, but it's a long song, so I'm going to stop and move forward because I think we've already gotten the specific lyrics that I want to deal with this morning. This is obviously a very moving and emotionally effective song. In my opinion, it uses just the right measure of pathos to present one of the easiest things in our lives to overlook, and that's how we're all, at our very core, the same. How no matter our station in life, how no matter what we've been through, at our core, we are all the same. And what's more, I think it spells this lesson out by pointing to the emotions that most definitively remind us of this truth. It doesn't talk about sheer happiness and joy, which are wonderful things we've talked about a whole lot, but instead this song speaks of sadness and loss and hurt and pain. It's these things that I believe most definitively remind us of the way at our core we're all the exact same. It's reminiscent of the famous Shakespeare quote from The Merchant of Venice: "If you prick me, do I not bleed? If you tickle me, do I not laugh? If you poison me, do I not die?" In other words, we're all in it together. We're bound together by our shared humanity. And nothing reminds us more of our shared humanity than recognizing in other people the same limitations that we innately know that we have ourselves. These emotions, sadness, hurt, pain, loss, that's what those things are. They're limitations. We can't avoid them. No matter how hard we try to construct lives that will shield us from them, which is what we do and what we should do, but no matter how hard we try to construct lives that will shield us from sadness, hurt, loss, and pain, we cannot avoid them. They're human limitations that we have. Thus, to connect with others on this level cements a much more abiding relationship than connecting on a more pleasing level, because when connecting on the level of a recognition of our own finitude, our real us connects to the other as opposed to our constructed self. That is when we form the most abiding relationships, when it's built on an understanding that we have both been through difficult situations and we recognize ourselves in the other. Now, all of that said, here are the lyrics I want to specifically focus on this morning from the Sister Hazel song. They say, "We all know sadness, and I feel your pain." Well, everybody knows a little loneliness sometimes, because we're all the same. We all have sorrow. We all have shame. Everybody feels a bit of emptiness sometimes. Take a look around you. Every face that you see, everybody gets a little paralyzed sometimes. It's the epidemic of our insanity. But there's a way to keep going, step by step. Try to fix what's been broken, brick by brick. While your life will keep coming year after year, drain the pain, tear by tear. Drain away the pain, tear by tear. I really believe we can all relate to these sentiments, because we've all been there. Many times, I imagine. We've all been through extreme hurt, through trials that have left us confused, angry, bitter, scared. And before we move forward, it's imperative that I point out, we seldom know when the person next to us has been through or is going through these situations. And I want to reflect on that for a moment, because more than anything we discussed this morning, I think this is the most important thing for us to remember. We seldom, if ever, know what others have been through, or even what they're going through right now. And we have this natural tendency to judge others and form opinions based on the limited perspective we have of them. We do this based on the persona they are either consciously or unconsciously presenting to the world. But this persona, of course, doesn't ever give us a true look at who that person is and what that person might be going through. It never tells us the whole story, because, in fact, that persona is constructed for that very reason. That's the whole reason that persona has been constructed. It's to hide the painful things that we don't want to publicize to the rest of the world. And we're going to come back to this idea. But first I want to look quickly at Luke 6. We 2 weeks ago read Luke 6, 27 through 37, and we went on to discuss forgiveness. This week I want to again turn to that same passage, but this time I want to focus on the imperative that's given to love others. So I'm picking up at Luke 6, 27. "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful. Because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Let's look one more time at a specific section of that passage, all right? If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? With this in mind, I want to read a passage from one of my favorite books, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And this is early in the story. There's a woman who's approached a priest, an elderly priest who's well respected in the community. And she is confessing to him how much she wants to be good, but how she finds that she's limited by herself. And here's where she picks up, and this is, to me, this is one of the most profound things I've ever read. She says, "You see, I so love humanity that, would you believe it, I often dream of forsaking all that I have, leaving my daughter behind and becoming a sister of mercy. I close my eyes and think and dream, and at that moment I feel full of strength to overcome all obstacles. No wounds, no festering sores could at that moment frighten me. I would bind them up and I'd wash them with my own hands. I would nurse the afflicted. I would be ready to kiss such wounds." And the priest looks at her and says, "This is much, and well that your mind is full of such dreams and not others. Sometime when aware, you may do a good deed in reality." And she responds, "Yes, but could I endure such a life for long? That's the chief question. That's my most agonizing question. I shut my eyes and ask myself, would you persevere long on that path? And if the patient whose wounds you are washing did not meet you with gratitude, but instead worried you with his whims without valuing or remarking your charitable services, began abusing you and rudely commanding you and complaining to your superior authorities, what then? Would you persevere in your love or not?" And here's where I just feel like it just gets so exciting. She says, "And do you know, I came with horror to the conclusion that if anything could dissipate my love to humanity, it would be ingratitude. In short, I am a hired servant. I expect my payment at once, that is praise, and the repayment of love with love. Otherwise, I am incapable of loving anyone." To me, this is one of the most trenchant passages in all of literature, especially as it pertains to our selfish nature, of how we, even in our own efforts at doing good, can still be driven by selfish motivation. For Dostoevsky's character here, we're seeking self-worth even in the ostensibly selfless things that we do. Even more in the moments we find ourselves most in love with humanity, is arguing that that's when we feel the most distaste for the individuals around us. Most interesting paradox ever. Dostoevsky is here separating the ideal of loving others with the practice of loving others. So then the question that we have to confront this morning is this. We understand the mandate, that is, we understand the Scripture tells us that we're to love others, and we sincerely want to follow this command. But then we bump up against A, either a feeling of hostility towards those we're supposed to love, or B, a realization that selfish motivation, not pure intention, is truly what's underlying our efforts at serving others. And this being the case, then, the question is, how can we truly and genuinely love other people? And that is the age-old question. And before I attempt to give some sort of an answer to that, I think it goes without saying that I would be highly remiss not to voice that this is just as much a difficulty for me as anyone else. Whatever I say from here forward, that does not mean that I have the market cornered on how to turn the ideal into the action. I realize that goes without saying, but I just want to make sure everybody knows that I am completely confessing that. First place I'd start, though, is by highlighting the need to distinguish the difference between loving others and liking others. To me, this is the proper starting point because I think it's very easy to assume that the two are the same. And so when we feel convicted that we need to do a better job of loving others, we begin by trying to engender in ourselves a feeling of affection for certain people for whom, honestly, we don't immediately feel natural affection. C.S. Lewis breaks this difference down very nicely in Mere Christianity. He writes, "Our love of ourselves does not mean that we always like ourselves. Instead, it means that we wish our own good. In the same way, love for our neighbors is quite a different thing from liking or affection. We like or are fond of some people and not others. It's important to understand that this natural liking is neither a sin nor a virtue. It's just a fact. But of course, what we do about it is either sinful or virtuous." So we separate natural liking from loving. And C.S. Lewis goes on with this line of thought, and I'm actually going to pick up reading directly from the book because I think he says a lot of important stuff here. He says, "But though natural liking should normally be encouraged, it would be quite wrong to think that the way to become charitable is to sit trying to manufacture affectionate feelings. Some people are cold by temperament. That may be a misfortune for them, but is no more a sin than having a bad digestion is a sin. It does not cut them out from the chance or excuse them from the duty of learning charity. The rule for all of us is perfectly simple. Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you're behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love him. If you injure someone you dislike, you will find yourself disliking him more. If you do him a good turn, you will find yourself disliking him less. There is indeed, though, one exception. If you do him a good turn, not to please God and obey the law of charity, but instead to show him what a fine, forgiving chap you are, and to put him in your debt, and then sit down to wait for his gratitude, you will probably be disappointed. People are not fools. They have a very quick eye for anything like showing off or patronage. But whenever we do good to another self, just because it is a self made like us by God, and desiring its own happiness as we desire ours, we shall have learned to love it a little more, or at least to dislike it a little less." So here we see Lewis arguing that the more we incline ourselves toward others, the more we slowly come to assume the very feelings we were at first simply trying to imitate. Then toward the end of that Lewis passage, we see a quick warning about what happens to the person who does this not for selfless reasons, but like in the passage I read from the Brothers Karamazov, someone who does it for self-gain. The writer and pastor Tim Keller, whose book The Reason for God I've drawn from extensively these past 2 weeks, he puts this in a slightly different way. He claims that there are two ways that we dodge practicing true selfless love for others. He calls them the two forms of self-centeredness. The first, he says, is we avoid selfless love purposely by overtly refusing to engage in it, by owning our own selfishness and in effect saying, it is what it is. The second, and the more subtle, he claims, is by trying to be very good and trying to keep all the rules, and in so doing, unconsciously becoming self-righteous. The problem with this route, Keller writes, is that we here are trying to earn God's grace. To make his point, Tim Keller quotes an incisive passage from Flannery O'Connor's novel Wise Blood, where the protagonist, Hazel Motes, quote, knew that the best way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. In other words, O'Connor's character, Hazel Motes, was operating under this legal code that suggested that if he upheld his end of the law, God was then responsible for providing him grace. I'd venture to guess that few of us look at life and grace this way, but I dare say many of us have a default understanding that this is how it works. At least I know that I do. My default, even though I know this isn't how grace is, intellectually I know this isn't how grace works, but my default is to see God and me as buddies trading favors with one another. That's my default. This is problematic, of course, for a whole host of reasons. But chief among them is that it cements for me an awareness that I'm very selfish. It exposes me as selfish, as being under the belief that I'm somehow capable of earning God's favor through things I do. And this, I'm sorry to admit, is just a very fancy way of defining pride. It's just semantics. It's saying the same thing. That's saying that I'm full of pride. And here's C.S. Lewis's take on the matter. This is really good, if I can find the page. In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you're proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. That raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say they believe in God and appear to themselves very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how He approves of them and thinks them far better than ordinary people. That is, they pay a pennyworth of imaginary humility to Him and get out of it a pound's worth of pride towards their fellow man. I suppose it was of those people Christ was thinking when He said that some would preach about Him and cast out devils in His name, only to be told at the end of the world that He had never, in fact, known them. The aforementioned Southern short story writer and novelist, Flannery O'Connor, she dealt with this theme quite often in her stories. This theme of the righteous being sinners and the sinners being righteous. I don't know that any writer's ever done as quality a job at presenting that truth. And she was famous for drawing these really grotesque characters. And I don't mean grotesque in the sense that their physical appearance was in some way grotesque. I mean that she over-exaggerated her characters and their proclivities so as to make the subtle truths of her stories more apparent for the reader. And one of her most famous stories, called Revelation, there's a character named Mrs. Turpin, and she and her husband Claude are in the waiting room of a doctor's office. And as Mrs. Turpin sits there, the narration shows her silently watching and judging everyone sitting around her. She's sizing them up, and she's finding herself superior to all of them. And soon enough, she strikes up a conversation with one of the women waiting with her. And as Mrs. Turpin talks, the more and more apparent it is to the reader how proud she is of herself, of how refined and proper and full of dignity she feels she is in comparison to the other people in the room. All the while they're talking, though, the woman's daughter, whose name is Mary Grace, she's been scowling with this really grotesque look, just an evil grimace / scowl that we as the reader have been seeing through O'Connor's narration that has been on this girl's face the entire time. And finally, Mrs. Turpin says in her conversation with the girl's mother, "If it's one thing I am, it's grateful. When I think who all I could have been besides myself and what all I got, I just feel like shouting, 'Thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is. I could have been different. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Thank you.'" At that very moment, Mary Grace, the daughter who has been eyeing Mrs. Turpin, she explodes, and she hurls her book at Mrs. Turpin, a book, by the way, which is titled Human Development. And she comes crashing across the table and she begins to choke Mrs. Turpin. She proceeds to have an epileptic fit, and Mrs. Turpin, at some level, suddenly realizes that this girl is a messenger from God trying to communicate something to her. And so Mrs. Turpin looks down at this girl and says, "What have you got to say to me?" Mary Grace looks up at her and she says, "Go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog." This is the revelation the story's title is referring to. It was revealed to Mrs. Turpin that she was no better than a warthog. And thus the last part of the story is Mrs. Turpin trying to wrap her head around this idea. So later that night, she is alone out by her own hog pen, and she says to God, "What do you send me a message like that for? How am I a hog and me both?" She pauses and thinks, and then she says, There's no trash around here that I haven't given to, and break my back to the bone every day working, and I do for the church. She pauses again, and she keeps thinking about that scene in the waiting room. She goes on, how am I a hog? Exactly how am I like them? There was plenty of trash there. It didn't have to be me. If you like trash, better go get yourself some trash then. You could have made me trash. If trash is what you like, why didn't you make me trash? I could quit working and take it easy and be filthy like them. Lounge about the sidewalks all day, drinking root beer. Dip snuff and spit in every puddle and have it all over my face. I could be nasty. Then finally she yells, go on, call me a hog. Call me a hog again. She pauses and then she screams, who do you think you are? Says the guy, who do you think you are? And here's how this story concludes. The color of everything, field and crimson sky, burned for a moment with a transparent intensity. The question carried over the pasture and across the highway and the cotton field, and returned to Mrs. Turpin clearly like an answer from beyond the wood. Mrs. Turpin stood there, her gaze fixed on the highway, all her muscles rigid. Then, like a monumental statue coming to life, she bent her head slowly and gazed, as if through the very heart of mystery, down into the pig parlor at the Halls. They had settled all in one corner around the old sow who was grunting softly. A red glow suffused them. They appeared to pant with a secret life. Until the sun slipped finally behind the tree line, Mrs. Turpin remained there with her gaze bent to the Halls, as if she were absorbing some abysmal, life-giving knowledge. At last she lifted her head. There was only a purple streak in the sky, cutting through a field of crimson and leading like an extension of the highway into the descending dusk. She raised her hands from the side of the pen in a gesture hieratic and profound. A visionary light settled in her eyes. She saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth through a field of living fire. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of freaks and lunatics, shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And then bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself in Claude, had always had a little of everything and had had the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. Yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. She lowered her hands and gripped the rail of the hog pen, her eyes small but fixed unblinkingly on what lay ahead. In a moment the vision faded, but she remained where she was, immobile. At length she got down and turned off the faucet and made her slow way on the darkening path to the house. In the woods around her the invisible cricket choruses had struck up, but what she heard were the voices of the souls climbing upward in the starry field and shouting, Hallelujah. What a profound story. I particularly love the moment of this story on which the whole meaning hinges. Mrs. Turpin looks into the hog pen and, quote, like a monumental statue coming to life, she bent her head slowly and gazed, as if through the very heart of mystery, down into the pig parlor at the Hogs. They had settled all in one corner around the old sow who was grunting softly. A red glow suffused them. They appeared to pant with a secret life. The very heart of mystery, it says. Suddenly she saw the old sow grunting softly, saw her babies feeding around her, and she saw the tie that connected her to the hogs. She realized that when everything else fades, she was no different than anyone else. That like the song Tear by Tear suggests, at her very root, just as at everyone else's very root, she was dependent. She was not self-sufficient. I watched a great movie on Friday night that I'd never heard of. It's called The Sunset Limited. It's only Tommy Lee Jones and Samuel L. Jackson. The whole movie, it takes place at one table. And it was based on a play written by the novelist Cormac McCarthy, who wrote No Country for Old Men and The Road, and he's one of our premier novelists. And in it there was a powerful line that speaks to this very idea, to this lesson that Mrs. Turpin had to learn. Samuel L. Jackson says to Tommy Lee Jones, "You might not like those other people. That doesn't mean you're not like those other people." How good is that? I'm going to say it again. You might not like those other people, but that does not mean you are not like those other people. As Lewis says, pride is when we do not see ourselves as infinitesimal in comparison to God. When we think that our own natural goodness is sufficient. I've always been moved by Leanne Womack's country song, "I Hope You Dance." It's a cheesy little pop song, but it's deep and it's moving, and I've always been incredibly moved by it. I hope that didn't.
We like it.
I love it. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. I love it. But what I've always liked the most about it is this one specific lyric. "I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean." I think that in life, it is so easy to buy into the lie that we are capable of generating our own goodness, that we are capable of earning God's love and grace, that we are capable of being our own Savior. But the problem with living under this misconception, as we've seen, is that we, without realizing it, begin feeling superior to others. And as soon as those feelings of superiority set in, we can then be certain that there's nothing at all humble about our faith. As Lewis says, we can then reflect on the fact that perhaps we've reverted back to worshiping, quote, an imaginary God. That, as Lewis says, we, quote, theoretically admit ourselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how much He approves of us and thinks us far better than other people. It's these very feelings of superiority to and a perceived disconnection with those around us that prevents us from genuinely reaching out and loving others. Thomas Merton, who's one of the most profound Christian thinkers of the 20th century, he once wrote, "Our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy. That's not our business, and in fact, it's nobody's business. What we are asked to do is to love. And this love itself will render both ourselves and our neighbors worthy." In his generation-defining memoir, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, the writer Dave Eggers describes the world as a lattice. After undergoing unthinkable hardship, Dave Eggers, for those who aren't familiar with the writer Dave Eggers, when he was 21 years old, both of his parents died within a month of one another. And he was left to raise his, I think at the time, 8-year-old brother. And after undergoing such unspeakable hurt, years later he fashioned this memoir, and as I said, it went on to define Generation X. It changed virtually the way that Generation X writers approach the art of writing, at least a lot of them. And in this memoir, among the chief concerns he had after undergoing that unthinkable and unspeakable pain, one of the chief concerns he had was the disconnection humanity feels from one another, and how, though we don't recognize it, we are all connected to one another. He calls it a lattice. That's his metaphor for how we're connected. He says the lattice is the connective tissue. I see us as one, as a vast matrix, an army, a whole, each one of us responsible to one another. The people who come to us or we come to, our friends, their friends, their friends. Who knows who? People who have everything in common, no matter where they're from. All these people know all the same things and truly hope for the same things. It's undeniable that they do. And if we can bring everyone to grab a part of the other, like an arm at the socket, everyone holding another's arm at the socket, and if we can get everyone to, instead of ripping this arm from the socket, instead hold to it tight and thus strengthening, like a human ocean moving as one, the undulating, the wave making. Or maybe it's like a snowshoe. You wear snowshoes when the snow is deep and porous. The lattice work within the snowshoe's oval distributes the wearer's weight over a wider area in order to keep him or her from falling through the snow. So people, the connections between people, the people you know, become a sort of lattice. And the more people, the more good people, they must be good people, the more you know who know and that they are there to help, the more these people you know and that know you and know your situation, your story, your troubles or whatnot, the wider and stronger the lattice, and the less likely you are to fall through the snow. I'm not reading that way accidentally. The new style he ushered in was this kind of stream of conscious style, the kind that Vince Vaughn made famous in comedy, and ironically they went to the same high school. I know, right? For Eggers, it's imperative that we realize how we are all connected. That whether we realize it or not, we're all connected. In the song One, which has been named by several music magazines as among the greatest songs ever written, the song One, U2 sings, it's one love, one life, it's one need in the night. It's one love and we get to share it. But it leaves you, baby, if you don't care for it. In the passage of the Brothers Karamazov, from which we read earlier, the priest, Father Zossimov, he concludes his conversation with the woman with this. Love in dreams is greedy for immediate action, meaning love in the ideal sense, is greedy for immediate action, rapidly performed and in the sight of all. Men will even give their lives if only the ordeal does not last long, but is soon over, with all looking on and applauding as though on the stage. But active love is labor and fortitude. And for some people, too, it's a complete science. But I predict that just when you see with horror that in spite of all of your efforts, you're getting further from your goal instead of nearer to it, at that very moment, I predict that you will reach it and then behold clearly the miraculous power of the Lord, who has been all the time loving and mysteriously guiding you. For some people, he says, loving others may at first be a matter of science, but soon enough it becomes a matter of the heart. And he or she suddenly sees the whole process, that whole difficult process of trying to learn to love others, begin seeing that whole process as an act wherein God all the while has been lovingly and mysteriously guiding him or her. A science with answers that give way to the heart. And with that in mind, I want to conclude by playing Coldplay's hit song, The Scientist. And instead of interpreting the lyrics through the perspective of a man singing to his beloved, think of the narrator of the song as voicing our collective feelings about our instinctive need for others, but our natural difficulty for reaching out and providing that very thing.
Let's go back to the start. Running in circles, calling in tails, heads on the sides apart. Nobody said it was easy. It's such a shame for us to part. Say take me back to the start. Just guessing at numbers and figures, pulling the puzzles apart. Questions of science, science and progress, do not speak as loud as my heart. Tell me you love me, come back and hold me. Oh, when I rush to the start, running in circles, chasing tails, coming back as we are. Nobody said it was easy. Oh, it's such a shame for us to part. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be so hard. I'm going back to the start.
We're running out of time, so I'll stop right there. It says, come up to meet you, tell you I'm sorry. I had to find you and tell you I need you. Tell me your secrets. Ask me your questions. Oh, let's go back to the start. I was just guessing at numbers and figures, pulling the puzzles apart. Questions of science, science and progress, not speak as loud as my heart. Nobody said it was easy. It's such a shame for us to part. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be this hard. It'll take me back to the start. Luke 6 says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them. And lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Nobody said it was easy. But nobody said it would be this hard. So let's go back to the start. The start is realizing that we are all the same. That we are all connected. That we are all small before God. But that we are all mighty under the power of His grace. I hope you all have a great morning. Thanks for
Thank you.